Welcome in, everybody, ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling governance systems.
Ah, governance, the ever so slight matter of how societies decide, well, how to run themselves. Should be interesting.
Right. We're talking everything from ancient structures to the ways modern nations are run. And trust me, there are more ways to structure power than you might think.
Always more complexity than meets the eye. Yeah.
Exactly. For example, did you know that the number of people globally who live under what experts would even call full democracy is shockingly small? It's like in the single digits. But we'll get to that later. We've got a lot to unpack.
Let's unpack them. Where shall we begin?
How about a little visual journey to get us started?
I'm all about a good visual. Paints 1,000 words, as they say.
Okay, so picture this. Imagine a charming little Swiss town nestled in the Alps. You see the townspeople gathered, maybe in the town square, debating some local issue. Then they all vote directly on the best way to handle it. That's direct democracy in action, folks.
Straight to the source. The citizens themselves holding the power.
Mhm.
Powerful indeed.
Right. Okay, now, totally different vibe. Let's rewind the clock way back to ancient Egypt. Think pyramids, pharaohs, the whole nine yards. The power structure there was completely different.
Now, those pharaohs, they weren't messing around. They were seen as divine rulers, appointed by the gods themselves.
Exactly. So we're talking about a theocracy where all power flows from a divine mandate, not from the people. Totally different way of thinking about things.
Night and day, those two examples.
Mm.
But they both get at a question every society has to grapple with. Who has the power? Who gets to make the decisions? And how? There's a whole spectrum of answers out there.
It's fascinating, really. Okay, so let's dive into some specific examples. And I think it makes sense to start with one of the oldest systems out there, monarchy. Close your eyes and imagine a grand hall decked out with jewels and fancy fabrics, and at the center of it all is the monarch. They are the heir to generations of authority and tradition.
The weight of history on their shoulders, you might say.
Definitely. And monarchies are really interesting because, on the one hand, there's a certain stability to them. Having a long line of rulers provides a sense of continuity and a clear line of succession. History also shows us, though, that monarchies can be risky.
Oh, absolutely. Unchecked power, well, it can have some downsides.
Totally. Because what happens when you have a ruler who isn't exactly benevolent? What happens when they rule with an iron fist? That's where things can go south.
It's a classic trade-off. Stability, sure, but at what cost? When individual liberties are sacrificed, you can end up with a system that's more about tyranny than tradition. When the ruler's word is law and dissent is silenced, that's when you know things are out of balance.
And that brings us to a modern example of a monarchy king Salman of Saudi Arabia. He's been in power since 2015 and is part of the House of Saud, which is this huge family with thousands of princes who all hold a certain amount of power in the country.
Oh, the House of Saud. They're a textbook example of how power operates in a monarchy.
Mhm.
It's often more complicated than it looks from the outside. It's not always just about the guy with the crown, right?
Mm,
There are families, advisors, entire power structures that come into play.
totally. It's definitely not as simple as just one person on a throne. It makes you think about how power really works, you know? And speaking of concentrated power, that leads us to another system dictatorship. You've got no messy elections to deal with, no drawn-out lawmaking processes, just straight-up swift action. At least that's the idea, anyway.
Efficient, you could say.
Yeah.
In theory, at least.
For sure. But there are some pretty big questions that come up with a system like that. Like, how do you make sure the dictator actually has the people's best interests at heart? What's stopping them from, well, becoming a tyrant?
Right, what mechanisms are in place to hold that kind of power in check? Because let's face it, power without accountability, that's a recipe for trouble, no matter how efficient things might seem.
And that, I think, is something worth remembering no matter what system we're talking about. Unchecked power is dangerous no matter how you slice it.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it, that whole unchecked power thing? And it's something that can happen just as easily with a small group calling the shots, not just a single dictator. Which brings us to...
Oligarchy, right.
Right.
Where instead of one person at the top, you've got a small elite group holding all the power.
Precisely. And often, those elites stay in power by keeping a tight grip on the things that really matter.
Resources, like land, wealth, even information. Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. And in an oligarchy, that knowledge, that power,
Yeah.
it tends to stay concentrated in the hands of the few. It reminds me of that old saying,
The rich get richer.
that's the one. Except in this case, it's more like the powerful get more powerful. Which actually makes me think back to our earlier example.
The House of Saud.
Yeah, when we really look at their influence in Saudi Arabia, it kind of blurs the lines, wouldn't you say? Is it a monarchy or is it an oligarchy? Or maybe?
A bit of both.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It just goes to show that these systems, they aren't always so clear-cut. They can overlap, influence each other, even transform into something totally new. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, so while we're on the topic of power dynamics within groups, it makes me think of another system, aristocracy.
Ah, aristocracy. The idea that the best should rule. At least that's the idea they like to sell.
In theory, sure, but that begs the question of how you even define best, right? Is it about family lineage, education, wealth, some kind of inherent virtue? It gets messy.
It does indeed. And even if we could all agree on who the best are, history's full of examples of rulers who,
Yeah. Didn't quite live up to the hype.
you could say that,
Yeah.
which reminds us that power dynamics can shift. What one era considers the ideal form of governance, another might see as totally unjust or outdated.
So true. And it highlights that we're not just talking about systems in the abstract, right? We're talking about how real people, real lives are affected by how power is structured.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the source of power, the justification for it, we have to talk about theocracy. It's a system where power flows from a higher authority.
Right, like in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were seen as divine intermediaries. They got their power directly from the gods.
Precisely. And that kind of belief can have a massive impact on a society, can it?
Hmm.
If you truly believe your ruler is divinely appointed, it adds a whole other level of authority.
For sure. It's like, who are you to question the will of the gods, right? It can definitely unify a populace, but it also brings up some tricky questions.
Right. What about the people who don't subscribe to the dominant religion? How does the theocracy handle dissenting voices when challenging the ruler is seen as, well, challenging the divine order?
It makes you think about that constant tension that exists in every system between maintaining order and protecting individual beliefs. But speaking of giving citizens a voice, that leads us to direct democracy.
Ah, direct democracy. Back to our Swiss town, are we?
Exactly. Imagine, instead of electing officials to represent you, the citizens themselves get together and debate, and then they vote directly on every single issue.
It sounds pretty good on paper, doesn't it? It's that idea of pure, unfiltered democracy where every voice has equal weight.
No more feeling like your vote doesn't count or that the politicians don't care what you think. But even with direct democracy, there are some potential downsides.
Oh, there always are. Every system has its flaws.
Right. For example, we were reading about this thing called the tyranny of the majority, where the rights of minority groups can get trampled on if the majority group thinks something else is more important.
A cautionary tale for any democracy, for sure. The rights of the individual versus the will of the group. It's a constant balancing act.
For sure. Plus, I don't know about you, but having to vote on literally every single decision that affects my life, that sounds exhausting.
Logistically speaking, it'd be a nightmare. Which is probably why in the modern world we see a lot more representative democracy.
Right. You elect people to, well, represent your interests. It definitely streamlines things on the surface.
In theory, it does. But that leaves the question of how effective that representation really is.
Good point. Like, are those elected officials actually fighting for the things their constituents care about? Especially when those interests clash with,
The desires of powerful lobbies
Mm.
or their own political ambitions.
It's tricky, right? Like, how do we even know? Are they really working for us, or are there other forces at play? Makes you wonder who's really pulling the strings.
It does raise some uncomfortable questions about how power really works in these systems. It's especially eye-opening then when you look at the actual numbers.
Oh, right. You're talking about that statistic we found.
Exactly. The Democracy Index 2019, they did this whole analysis, and get this. Only 5.7% of the world's population actually lives in what they classify as a full democracy.
5.7%. That's like hardly anyone. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Makes you wonder, if full democracy is so rare, what does that say about all these systems we've been talking about?
It's a sobering thought, for sure. Maybe a little dose of reality is what we need sometimes to really understand how these things work, beyond the textbooks and the theories.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, each of these systems, monarchy, dictatorship, oligarchy, all of them, they're all trying to answer the same question, aren't they?
Which is,
How should power be shared or not shared within a society? How do you decide Who gets to make the decisions that affect everyone?
And how do you keep those people accountable? That's a big one.
Huge. And as we've seen, there's no easy answer, is there? There are pros and cons to every system, potential for both good and bad. It's like this constant balancing act, trying to create a system that protects individual freedom, but also serves the greater good.
It's tough, man. Like, how do you find that balance? Because if we're being honest, no system is perfect.
Right. Not even close. And that's okay. The important thing is to be aware of that, to acknowledge the trade-offs, the compromises, the inherent messiness of it all. The more we understand the complexities, the better equipped we are to, well, navigate them.
So what you're saying is we need to be having these conversations. We need to be thinking critically about these systems, questioning them, challenging them even.
100%. We can't just accept things at face value. We have to be willing to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface, to consider all sides of the issue.
And that, my friends, is what we like to call a deep dive. So until next time.
Keep asking questions. And if you were in charge, how would you design the perfect system? What would it look like? How would you prevent those in power from, well, abusing that power?
Those are some seriously thought-provoking questions. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder. Thanks for